I didn't live a perfect life. I lived a real one. Michael Madsen. How do you bury a man who never truly fit into this world? How do you say farewell to someone whose pain was never hidden, only woven into every character he ever played? On a somber morning, under a gray California sky, Hollywood gathered to say its final goodbye to one of its most unforgettable souls. Michael Madsen, the actor, the poet, the broken warrior, was laid to rest. A funeral marked not by glitz, but by grief. Not by fanfare, but by silence. Heavy, reverent silence. Friends, family, and longtime collaborators sat shoulder to shoulder, many wiping away tears they never thought they'd shed for a man they once believed was unbreakable. But Michael Madsen was never invincible. He was just incredibly good at making pain look like strength. His casket, simple and dark, was draped with a single black and white photo from the Reservoir Dogs set. The man in the picture smirked at the camera. Young, dangerous, alive. That's how many wanted to remember him. Not broken by loss, not silenced by sorrow, but on his own terms, in full command of a scene. At the funeral, his eldest son, Christian, stood to speak. His voice cracked as he said, "My dad wasn't perfect, but he was real. He gave me love, he gave me words, and he gave me the courage to be my own kind of different. He was misunderstood by the world, but never by me." Quentin Tarantino, the director who helped launch Madsen into cult fame, didn't give a speech, but left behind a handwritten note that was placed at the foot of the casket. It read simply, "You gave everything to every scene. I only wish I had more scenes with you in life. Rest easy, brother." The ceremony was filled with moments of raw emotion. Thurman, a longtime friend, broke down as she recited lines from one of Madsen's unpublished poems, written after the death of his son Hudson. "I walked through fire with a wet heart, trying to find the one place I didn't lose him. There was no red carpet, no paparazzi, no hollow statements from the industry, only the aching honesty of grief from those who knew the man behind the tough guy mask. The man who called his friends late at night just to ask if they were okay. The man who always remembered birthdays. The man who was still mourning his son right up until the end." Michael Madsen didn't want a grand Hollywood send-off. In his will, he requested that his funeral be small, real, and surrounded by love, not lights. And that's exactly what it was. His favorite Bob Dylan song, "Not Dark Yet," played softly as mourners filed out. A final bow. A final song. As the last mourners trickled away from the graveside, a hush settled over the hillside cemetery. A silence that spoke louder than any eulogy ever could. The air was heavy with sorrow, yet still laced with the reverence reserved for someone who had left a lasting mark on the world. Among the few who remained was one of Michael Madsen's grandsons, no older than 10, his small hand gripping a rose almost too large for him to carry. He approached the freshly turned earth slowly, hesitantly, as if the reality of goodbye hadn't yet fully registered. With the innocence only a child can carry into such a moment, he placed the flower at the base of the headstone and whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I love you, Grandpa. I hope you're happy now." There were no cameras, no publicists, no paparazzi. Just grief, just memory, just love. As the final rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, a soft wind passed through the trees, rustling the leaves like the closing pages of a story, one filled with triumph, heartbreak, and raw, undiluted humanity. Michael Madsen's funeral wasn't about the movie star. It wasn't about Reservoir Dogs or Kill Bill, or his legendary collaborations with Quentin Tarantino. It wasn't about the violence of his characters or the swagger of his walk. It was about the man, the complicated, wounded, fiercely loyal man who existed when the spotlights dimmed and the scripts were set aside. He was many things. A father, one who loved imperfectly, but with all he had. Madsen raised 6 children, each with stories of both pain and pride. They knew a dad who sometimes struggled with his own demons, but who never stopped trying. They remembered late-night talks, impulsive road trips, handwritten birthday letters, and quiet apologies that meant more than they could ever explain to outsiders. The death of his son Hudson tore him apart, but in the years that followed, he still tried to hold the rest of the family together, even while quietly crumbling himself. A friend, the kind who would show up without being asked. Stories shared at the funeral recalled how Madsen would often drive across the city just to drop off a book, a mixtape, or a poem. He wasn't the kind of friend who gave polished speeches. He was the kind who sat in silence with you when things fell apart. He was the guy who returned calls at 3 a.m., the man who remembered your mother's name, even if he hadn't seen you in years. Hollywood may have known the actor, but the people in that cemetery knew the man. A fighter, not just in the barroom brawler sense his characters often portrayed, but in the way he battled through addiction, depression, grief, and regret. Madsen never sugarcoated his struggles. He didn't pretend to be a hero. In fact, he often called himself a survivor of self-inflicted storms. He entered rehab more than once, sought therapy, and leaned on art to keep himself afloat. Every poem he wrote, every scene he delivered, every conversation he had was laced with the quiet resilience of someone who refused to stay down. A fragile soul, though many never saw that side. He spoke often about how misunderstood he felt, how acting was the only space where he could truly be free. His poetry was filled with longing for forgiveness, for peace, for connection. A friend who spoke at the funeral recited one of his unpublished poems, written just weeks before his passing. I walked through mirrors, breaking every one, hoping the shards would show me something whole, but they only cut deeper. In those words, as in many of his private writings, we saw not the villain, but the man trying to make peace with himself. Madsen's funeral was intimate, raw, and heartbreakingly honest. It wasn't about glorifying the fame. It was about confronting the cost of it. His family chose not to play any of his movie scenes during the service. Instead, they shared home videos. Michael laughing in the backyard, reading poetry to his grandkids, burning toast in the kitchen, playing catch in the driveway. In the end, those were the moments that defined him. Not the blood-soaked suits or the cult favorite monologues, but the quiet, unrecorded seconds when he let his guard down, when he was just Michael, not Mr. Blonde. As the sky darkened and the final goodbyes were whispered, one of his closest friends said through tears, "He lived fast, he lived hard, but he also lived truthfully. He was broken, sure, but he was never fake." And that's more than you can say for most people in this town. The curtain didn't fall with applause. There was no standing ovation, only a deep, lingering ache, a collective recognition that we had lost someone who was real in a world often built on illusions. Michael Madsen didn't need to pretend. He was the roles he played, because he had lived them in some way. Every scar, every line on his weathered face, every flicker of pain in his eyes, they were earned, they were honest. And now, they are memories. Memories held in the hearts of his family. Memories whispered in poetry no one else may ever read. Memories sealed in the silence of that final graveside moment, where love met loss beneath a setting sun. Michael Madsen didn't play the hero. He didn't wear a cape. He didn't pretend to be perfect. But perhaps in a world full of masks, that was the most heroic thing of all.